What would you do if you saw an elderly man dressed in plain clothes collapse in the lobby of a luxury hospital and no one bothered to go near? No ID, no insurance, no next of kin. The receptionist asked just one question. Do you have an appointment? Doctors walked past. Not a single one stopped. But one young woman did. She wasn't wearing a white coat. She didn't have a medical degree. She was just a janitor on the night shift, pushing stretchers. And she did something no one else dared to do, even though it could have cost her job. What no one knew at that moment was that the man who seemed like a nobody was actually the founder and CEO of the entire hospital. And the action that young woman took that day would go on to change the entire healthcare system in America. There's a kind of silence in luxury hospitals that isn't like anywhere else. It's not the silence of professionalism, nor is it rooted in empathy. It's a silence bought with money. Every blink has a price. Every nod comes with an insurance card. And if you've got nothing in your pocket, you've got no voice. That morning, in the main lobby of Rourke Medical in Houston, one of the most expensive private hospital chains in the American South, everything seemed business as usual. Receptionists in tailored suits, fresh flowers replaced daily, the scent of disinfectant mingling with faint rose water. A high-end coffee machine clicked in the far right corner, where morning shift nurses lined up, AirPods in their ears, phones in hand, and eyes that didn't really meet anyone else's. But one thing wasn't normal that morning. An elderly man slumped on the floor near the revolving door, gasping for breath, clutching his chest, eyes wide with panic. He wasn't accompanied. No ambulance had brought him in. No visible sign suggested he belonged in this place, except for the very real pain on his face. He wore a worn-out shirt, faded khaki pants, and wrinkled sneakers whose laces were nearly frayed through. His left hand was wrapped in a coarse cloth, perhaps to cover a wound or retain warmth. On his right hand was a tarnished silver ring, engraved with AR barely legible. His body shook in spasms, as though the oxygen had been vacuumed from his lungs. A passing visitor paused and crouched down to help, but the moment a receptionist stepped forward, that person straightened up and stepped aside. "Sir, are you lost?" the receptionist asked, not rudely but completely devoid of urgency. "No. Are you okay?" No sign she believed he might actually be a patient. The man tried to speak, but his words came out in gasps. "Chest. Tight. Okay, do you have your insurance card with you?" He shook his head, not because he didn't understand, but because he couldn't breathe. "Social security number?" "Any ID?" Another shake. She glanced toward the adjoining desk, where preliminary files were usually processed, then looked back at him. "Sir, I can't admit you unless we confirm identity. This is a private facility. You'll need to go to County General if you can't provide any documentation." A nearby nurse overheard and approached, eyebrows raised. "If he's crashing, we can't just leave him here." The receptionist whispered, "He just walked in off the street. No ID. Could be a liability." Throughout the exchange, no one knelt to meet the man at eye level. They spoke about him as if he were a risk, not a life. He tried to stand, staggering, gripping the reception desk, his face flushed red from the effort, then collapsed again. His fall sent a nearby guest's coffee cup flying, leaving a wet streak that spread down the edge of the corridor. And in that exact moment, she stepped into the frame. A girl in a faded navy blue uniform pushed an empty gurney, walking with quiet purpose. No earbuds, no phone, not in a rush, just eyes scanning for someone. She stopped the instant she saw him fall. Without asking, without waiting, she dropped the gurney handles and knelt beside him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder, like a family member would. "Sir, can you hear me?" she whispered. "I'm here. You're not alone." A security guard jogged over from the distance. "Hey, don't touch him. We haven't cleared anything yet." The girl turned her head, not loud but firm. "He needs help now, not clearance." No one responded, because no one reacts to a floor tech. She used her strength to pull him onto the gurney, though he weighed nearly twice as much. As the wheels began to roll, doctors walking by stepped aside, not out of respect, but to avoid involvement. She pushed the gurney down the hallway, shielding him from the apathy that surrounded them. She pulled a thin hospital blanket over his chest held his hand tightly and kept going, though no one had ordered her to, and no one came to help. Her name was faintly printed on a plastic badge, Kiana M., Support Services. A nurse from the emergency bay rushed over, trying to stop her. "This patient hasn't been checked in. You can't just bring him in here." Kiana raised her head. "He's crashing. You want to wait for paperwork or save a life?" The silence returned for a few long seconds. Then she continued pushing him straight into room 3. Down the hallway, the security cameras were still rolling, and it would be that exact footage in the weeks to come that would make the entire country stop and watch. But right now, no one knew. No one acknowledged. No one thanked her. Because to most people at Rourke Medical, Kiana was just the girl with the gurney, and the frail old man, with his worn clothes and failing breath, was just a problem case. Not a patient, not a client, no insurance, no ID, no reason to be treated as human. Only, they were all wrong, and that mistake would shake the very foundation of America's private healthcare system. From emergency room 3, an eerie silence settled in right after Kiana pushed the unknown man through the door. The attending nurse stood frozen, caught between two instincts: the routine pull of paperwork procedures and the stark realization that a life might slip away if they waited even a second longer. Kiana didn't wait for orders. She locked the stretcher wheels, lowered the headrest just enough, then leaned over to check the man's pulse using a portable device attached to the bed. He was still breathing, but barely, each gasp sounding like it came from a steep downhill struggle. His eyes couldn't open anymore, and his fingers began twitching in delayed spasms. In that moment, she turned to the nurse and said quietly, "I don't need permission to care." A young doctor named Moore stepped in with a confused look. He glanced at the patient, then over at Kiana. "This patient isn't on the chart. Who brought him in?" Kiana didn't turn. "I did. He collapsed in the lobby. No ID, no insurance. But he was clearly crashing." Moore sighed and stepped back outside to call the head nurse on his radio. Less than a minute later, the door swung open again. This time it was Kiana's direct supervisor, Loretta Mears, well known for her iron rule. "Support staff do not interact with patients." Loretta's eyes scanned the room like an X-ray and locked onto Kiana, who was fitting a blood pressure cuff around the man's arm. "Ms. Moore," she said, "you are not certified to perform any medical task. What do you think you're doing?" Kiana didn't flinch. Her hand stayed on the patient. "Trying to keep him alive." Loretta marched forward, her voice dropping into a hiss. "That's not your job. You're not medical staff. You push stretchers, you clean, you follow protocol, you don't diagnose, you don't interfere." "Then someone else should have," Kiana replied calmly. Not defiant, but direct. The words hung in the air like a needle dropped in water. Nurse Moore looked at Loretta, then away. A few seconds later, a monitor beeped sharply. The patient began to seize, limbs trembling under the sheet. Kiana didn't hesitate. She hit the emergency call button. The overhead lights shifted to a soft red, and a silent alert spread through the ER. Loretta stepped back, flipped her radio open. "Code blue, room 3, unregistered patient. Immediate physician required." Within moments, a team of 3, a doctor, a resident, and an ER nurse, burst in. No one asked why the patient was there. They saw only an urgent case, an undocumented stretcher, and someone who needed a cardiac response immediately. As the medical team set up their equipment, Loretta grabbed Kiana by the arm and pulled her out into the hallway. The familiar scent of antiseptic still clung to the air, but now it carried a weight. "Kiana," Loretta said, using her first name instead of Miss Moore for the first time, "do you realize what you've done? You violated direct hospital policy." "Policy didn't collapse in the lobby. A man did," Kiana answered. "Don't be clever. You've compromised our legal protections. You acted beyond your clearance level. If he dies, we're exposed." "If I hadn't stepped in, he would have died on the floor," Kiana said, raising her voice for the first time. "And you would have stepped over him to refill your coffee." Loretta froze for a fraction of a second, then lowered her voice. "This is not a shelter. It's a private hospital. There are rules, protocols. You're not a hero. You're just support staff." Kiana didn't react. No anger, no tears. Just eyes wide open, quieter than even the automatic doors sliding shut behind them. Then let the record show, she said, that a support staff was the only one who cared. Loretta clenched her fist. We're not done here. She walked away. Each step echoed against the white tile floor like the cracking sound of a wall that the hospital system had built long ago, with pay grades, ID badges, and job titles like shackles. That afternoon, Kiana's shift went on as usual. She mopped the floor in the testing lab, pushed laundry carts down the third-floor hallway, and delivered documents to the pharmacy as per her routine. No one looked at her like she'd saved a life. No one mentioned the man from the morning, as if he'd never existed. In HR, Loretta filed a formal violation report to the executive board. Title: Unauthorized Intervention by Non-Medical Personnel. Recommended action: verbal warning. Consider probation pending review. But no one noticed that the report didn't include one crucial line: the patient survived. And no one, not even Loretta, knew that the security camera had recorded every second Kiana knelt down, bent forward, and told that unknown man, "I'm here. You're not alone." Elsewhere in the city, in a high-rise apartment overlooking downtown Houston, a man was watching that footage on a tablet. On the screen, the girl with the stretcher pushed through the hallway, eyes steady, steps firm. He tapped the frame to pause. A perfect moment, like the camera had known that this second would change everything. He closed his eyes and smiled, not with satisfaction, but with the quiet relief of someone who'd just found hope in a place he thought was beyond saving. Because that man was the anonymous patient from that morning, and he, unbeknownst to anyone, was Nathaniel Rourke, founder of the Rourke Medical Network, the man who had disguised himself as an undocumented patient, and the man who had just discovered the first spark in a reform he once believed was impossible. When Kiana's shift ended at 9 p.m., she didn't head straight home. As had become a quiet ritual for more than 3 years, she stopped by the small coffee shop on the ground floor of the apartment complex where her grandmother lived. Not because the coffee was any good, it wasn't, but because the shop owner always left a warm cup of ginger tea on the counter, waiting for her with a handwritten note. Your grandmother was smiling today. Keep going, Kay. Tonight the tea carried a hint of mint, and the note had an extra line. And she asked about your shoes. Again. Kiana chuckled softly and walked slowly toward the elevator, carrying a cup that had already cooled halfway. Her grandmother, Mary Bell Morrison, was the only blood relative Kiana had left. A former history teacher, Mary Bell had suffered a stroke at 68, and ever since then, her speech came in fragments, her memory like a flickering radio signal, sometimes clear, sometimes static. But on her lucid days, she always asked the same question. Kiana, do you remember your mother? And Kiana never forgot. She couldn't forget, because her mother didn't die in an accident or of some terminal illness. She died in the back of an ambulance parked right outside a hospital gate, where the attending staff said, "We don't take uninsured patients at this hour. Please take her to county." Kiana had been 12. Sitting beside her mother, clutching a fabric pouch filled with every cent they'd saved, she screamed and cried, "She can't breathe! Please!" But the doors stayed closed. No nurse ran out. No doctor opened the gate. The paramedic, no villain, just someone caught in a system, quietly turned the vehicle around and headed toward the public hospital. They didn't make it. Her mother, Clarice Morrison, died in Kiana's arms, less than 50 steps from the emergency room. And for the next 20 years, those 50 steps remained a wound Kiana carried in her heart every single day. After her mother's death, Mary Bell moved in to raise Kiana. They lived in a small apartment in Southeast Houston, relying on her grandmother's retired teacher's pension and the leftover change she'd saved from years of teaching. When Kiana entered high school, she was offered a full scholarship to study nursing. She declined, not because she feared needles or lacked the intelligence, but because she didn't want to become part of the system that had turned her mother away. She couldn't bring herself to wear a white coat and walk through the doors that once refused her mother's life, as if it had never happened. Instead, she chose another path, quieter, less prestigious, but more honest to her soul. She applied for a support staff position at Rourke Medical through a referral. During the interview, the hiring manager asked, "Why do you want to push these stretchers instead of becoming a nurse?" And she simply answered, "Because the one who pushes the stretcher is the last person to touch a patient before they go somewhere no one hears them anymore. For 3 years at Rourke Medical, she never told her story. No coworker knew her mother had died outside a hospital door. No one knew that every time she heard an ambulance siren outside the glass lobby, her heart skipped a beat. And no one knew the reason she always knelt down to meet patients at eye level, even though no one asked her to, was because she still remembered how everyone once stood above her mother and refused to look her in the eye. That's why, on that morning, when the man collapsed on the lobby floor gasping for air and no one moved, Kiana didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for his name, didn't ask for his insurance, didn't care who he was, because to her, he was Clarice Morrison all over again. He was the chance to do what she couldn't 20 years ago, the chance to heal a wound that had never closed with an act that needed no credentials. When she got home that night, she took off her worn-out shoes and sat beside her grandmother's bed. Her grandmother was still awake, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, then turning toward her granddaughter. "Kiana, did you go to school today?" She smiled. That question came up several times a month, and each time she answered the same way. "No, Grandma, I went to work." "Don't let people call you dumb for pushing stretchers, you hear?" Her grandmother whispered, eyes closing again. "I've seen nurses look away, doctors walk out, but you never left anyone behind." Kiana held her grandmother's hand. She didn't say a word, but her chest felt heavier than the stretcher she pushed every day. And then, that very night, while the city slept and Rourke Medical dimmed its hallway lights, an internal email was sent to the hospital system's leadership. Incident report, unregistered patient admitted without authorization. Attached was a recommendation to investigate a support staff employee for acting beyond her role and potentially creating legal liability. Signed, Loretta Mears. What Loretta didn't know, and what the entire system didn't either, was that the man listed in the report as Patient X didn't appear in any patient record because he had requested to be erased from the system immediately after leaving the ER. He didn't want to be tracked, didn't want to be found, not because he was afraid, but because he was observing. In a private office on the top floor of a tower downtown, a different record was being written. By hand, employee report, emergency event, Kiana Moore. Author, Nathaniel Rourke. Beside him was a clipped segment from the hallway security footage. He paused the video at the exact moment Kiana placed her hand on his chest, her eyes locked in, her lips tight from tension. Beneath the frame, he scribbled a single line, just 8 words. "The only one who saw me human." He didn't know much about Kiana, didn't yet know why she acted the way she did. But he knew this: if a support staff member with no authority, no title, and every reason to stay silent still chose to save someone at the risk of punishment, then that wasn't rebellion. That was integrity. And that integrity was something he believed his entire system had long lost. The dry coughing started again in the late afternoon. Not from Kiana, but from inside emergency room 3, where the unidentified patient, as temporarily noted, was lying on stretcher 117C. Kiana stood in the hallway, holding a small medical supply bag a resident nurse had asked her to drop off at storage. But her eyes never left that door. The privacy curtain was fully drawn. No doctor had gone in for nearly 10 minutes. The heart monitor still displayed, but the beeping had grown slow and sparse. She could hear each fading tone like a delayed clock. Every pause a quiet slice into someone's will to live. She knew that sound, not because she studied medicine, but because she had once listened to it go silent, inside an ambulance where her mother had been. The beeps short, rapid, then longer, then none. A young nurse passed by. Kiana spoke up. "Excuse me, has anyone been in room 3 recently?" The nurse raised a brow. "You mean the John Doe? He's stable. They're still waiting on record matches before proceeding." "Waiting?" Her voice stiffened. "He was seizing earlier." "Yeah, but the attending physician said to hold. No ID, no insurance confirmation, so..." That sentence broke apart before it finished. She didn't need to hear the rest. Kiana set the supply bag down on a nearby chair and quickly walked toward room 3. A doctor stood near a computer screen, reviewing charts. She called out, "Excuse me, he's getting worse." The doctor, without looking up, replied flatly, "We've been told to wait." Orders from Dr. Simmons. Kiana said nothing more. She turned away, seeming to accept the answer. But seconds later, she returned, lowered her body, and began pulling the stretcher from beneath the patient's bed. His eyes were still closed, but sweat glistened on his brow, and his lips were pale, dry, and faintly blue. She placed her hand on his chest and felt the heartbeat, rapid, disconnected. Without waiting for approval, she began rolling the stretcher out of the room. A nurse spotted the movement and ran up. "Hey, where are you taking him?" She didn't stop. "To surgery intake. His vitals are crashing. If no one else will move, I will." That's against protocol." "Then let protocol explain why a man died in room 3. That line sliced the hallway into silence. A resident doctor started to follow, but stopped. No one could halt someone doing the right thing when they no longer cared about permission. Kiana pushed the stretcher through the east corridor toward the emergency surgical intake wing. The doors were restricted to senior staff, but in a beat of fate, the gatekeeper, an older doctor she had once helped carry supply boxes, saw her and pressed the unlock button. No questions, no suspicion, just a silent nod. "Prep room 3, she called to a nearby intern. "Unconscious male, unidentified, vitals unstable." "Wait, he's not on our chart." "Then chart later, or chart a death." She rolled the stretcher straight into room 3 and joined the nursing staff to prepare the equipment. A senior surgeon entered, squinted slightly at the patient's face, then turned to Kiana. "Where's his chart?" "He doesn't have one, just a heartbeat." The doctor checked the monitor. The patient's heart rate was plummeting. There was no time for rules. He shook his head and motioned to the team. "Let's move. 4th line, BP monitor, prepare for intubation." Within 30 seconds, the emergency OR was alive like a scene out of a film. Only no one remembered the patient's name, and no one knew the identity of the girl who wheeled him in. Just silent movements between rare souls who still chose lives over paperwork. Outside, as the operation began, Loretta stepped into the ER intake and froze at the sight of the now empty stretcher in room 3. She grabbed her radio. "Where's the John Doe patient?" "Moore. Has anyone seen Kiana Moore?" A nurse replied, "I think she took him into emergency surgery." "Excuse me? She what?" Loretta stormed toward the surgical wing, her heels clapping hard against the polished floor. When she arrived, the doors were sealed. The in-operation light glowed red. She reached for the side entry, locked. A desk nurse calmly told her, "You can't enter during emergency procedures." "She's not even authorized to bring him here." The nurse raised an eyebrow. "Well, someone authorized the operation." Loretta stood frozen, her hand trembling slightly around the radio. A low static hissed as she pressed the button, without any idea what to say. Because in that moment, no policy, no rule book, no form could outweigh a humanitarian act that had already begun. And on the operating table, the nameless man was saved. Not because the system did the right thing, but because one woman dared to do the wrong thing for the right reason. The wall clock in the HR office read exactly 7:11 a.m. when Loretta Mears walked in, carrying a printed file folder and a tablet loaded with footage pulled from the security cameras. Her face was stone cold, devoid of expression, except for the permanent crease between her eyebrows. The one employees often joked was her signature of disapproval. Inside the room, Kiana was already seated, uniform neat, hands folded properly in her lap. No lawyer, no union rep, just a support worker summoned for overstepping authority and causing significant internal risk. 1 minute later, Dr. Simmons entered. He didn't sit. He leaned casually against the desk, holding a steaming cup of coffee. The badge on his coat read, Chief of Emergency Medicine, catching the reflection of the white fluorescent ceiling. He glanced at Kiana like one might at a fly that had wandered into a boardroom. "Let's be clear," Loretta began in a monotone voice. "This is not a formal disciplinary hearing, yet. But due to the nature of what occurred yesterday and the unauthorized decisions made, we need answers." Kiana nodded. She said nothing, didn't bow her head, didn't resist. Loretta tapped the tablet and played the video. The screen showed Kiana pushing the patient out of the ER, ignoring the nurse's protest, and entering the emergency surgery wing. The footage had no sound, but the look in Kiana's eyes required no audio. Steady, focused, fearless. When the clip ended, Loretta lowered the tablet and stared directly at her. Do you acknowledge that this happened? Yes. Do you understand that by doing this, you violated hospital policy, bypassed medical command, and put a patient at potential procedural risk? Kiana responded, I understand what I did, and I'd do it again. Dr. Simmons let out a short laugh, sipped his coffee, then set the cup down. So what exactly made you think you were qualified to make that call? You clean floors, you push beds. That doesn't mean you get to decide who lives or dies. Kiana turned toward him without flinching. No, it doesn't, but apparently neither does standing around and doing nothing. Simmons' face tightened. Loretta stepped in. Kiana, this isn't about your intentions. It's about chain of command. Do you believe you're more capable of making medical decisions than licensed doctors? Kiana answered clearly, word for word. I believe a beating heart deserves more than silence. And if everyone with a license is too afraid to act because a man doesn't have a file, then maybe we've forgotten what medicine is for. Simmons snapped his fingers dismissively. Do you know how many lawsuits this hospital faces in a year? Do you know what happens when one unauthorized person causes one mistake? Kiana tilted her head. Do you know what happens when an entire hospital lets a man die on the floor because he didn't bring ID? Loretta raised her hand to cut them off. Enough. This isn't about philosophy. This is about accountability. Kiana nodded slightly. Exactly. And I was the only one who felt any. Outside, the intercom chimed with the announcement for the senior staff meeting. Loretta glanced at the clock, then shuffled her papers. We'll make a final decision after internal review. Until then, consider yourself under probation. You're not to engage directly with patients, and you will be reassigned to non-critical areas. Dr. Simmons crossed his arms. Frankly, I think she should be let go. We don't need rogue heroes here. We need order. Kiana stood up. No protest, no shouting. She said only one thing before leaving the room. If a man dies, order doesn't matter. And then she walked out, back straight, steps unwavering. Every staff member in the hallway stepped aside. Not because she was threatening, but because something in her silence made them afraid to speak. Back in the conference room, Dr. Simmons picked up the tablet again and rewound the footage. His eyes paused on the 13th second, the moment Kiana placed her hand on the patient's chest. He stared at that hand, not trained, not certified, but the gesture had somehow mobilized an entire surgical team. His brow furrowed, not with regret, but with the sting of being challenged, for the first time. Loretta muttered, "She's a problem." Simmons replied, "Or a symbol. Depends who finds the footage first." They didn't know. Not yet. But on the top floor of the building, in a quiet executive office belonging to the man once known as the anonymous patient, a phone buzzed with a new internal message. Camera footage ID number R X117. Reviewed. Prepare transcript. The man put down his tea, looked out the window, and smiled. The next day it rained. A typical Houston rain, not heavy but steady and cold, just enough to make the bright white of Rourke Medical appear dull behind the glass. Kiana started her morning shift at 6:45 as usual, her first time back since being reassigned from the emergency wing. She now worked in the rehabilitation unit, an area with fewer people, where patients were either recovering or waiting for discharge. She didn't react to the transfer, but her eyes betrayed her, constantly flicking toward the east hallway, where she had pushed that stretcher into the OR just the day before. When she checked the day's sanitation list, something immediately felt off. Kiana had a habit of scanning patient names on the room allocation board, not out of curiosity, but so she could call patients by name if they needed help. But today, emergency room 3, where the unidentified patient had been operated on, no longer showed John Doe. Instead, it was labeled unavailable, with a tag that read room sanitized, just one day after the surgery. No name, no medical notes, no ICD code, no nurse assigned, just a blank field, wiped clean on the hospital's internal system. She asked the attending nurse, "What happened to the patient in ER3? "The man I brought in." The answer was a shrug. "Discharged, I think? Or maybe transferred." "I don't know. Simmons signed off on the file." "Simmons?" "Yeah, but it's weird. There's no full record. We just got a memo saying the room's been cleared." "Did anyone pick him up?" "I don't think so. No family visit was logged at the front desk. Kiana walked to the logistics office and grabbed the ID scanner she typically used to check stretcher and supply inventory. She quietly scanned the tag of stretcher 117C, the one she had used to push the unknown patient. But the system returned an unusual message. Asset not assigned. History purged. She went further and checked the ID of the operating room used during the procedure. The only data available: procedure registered. No name. No surgeon assigned. As if the entire file had been scrubbed, leaving a blank space that couldn't be deleted, yet couldn't be accessed either. A tight, aching unease began to build in her chest. She wasn't a doctor, didn't have access to medical records, but she knew this much. No emergency surgery patient vanishes like that. No name, no family, no discharge form, no sign of existence. She returned to the reception desk, where the hallway surveillance footage was stored. Taking advantage of a technician's absence, she pulled up footage from 2 days ago. But the time frame between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m., the window when the patient would have been moved to recovery, was gone. The file read, corrupted footage, archive unavailable. She sat for a while staring at the black screen. Her mind raced with 100 questions. If he died, where was the death certificate? If he lived, where was the discharge form? If transferred, why no transport log? None of it added up. And worse, no one else seemed to care. She confronted Loretta in the hallway during a chance encounter. "Did you hear what happened to the man I brought in?" Loretta didn't stop walking. "He's no longer our concern. Focus on your duties." "Is he alive?" Loretta turned her head, her eyes cold as cement. "Why do you care so much? He was a nobody." Kiana bit her lip but didn't respond. Because to her, he wasn't a nobody. He was a reminder of her past, a symbol of forgotten justice, a second chance at what she had once failed to do for her mother, and this time, she hadn't stayed silent. She left her shift that day with a heaviness like stone lodged in her chest. That night, she couldn't sleep. Instead, she printed the hospital's limited access patient activity log for the past 3 days, something logistics staff could still access for transportation tracking. One entry stood out: a medical vehicle with no ID number, marked as entered and exited loading dock at exactly 4:12 p.m., with no patient name attached. The only badge used for access: Rourke Internal Transfer, Confidential Clearance. Rourke Internal. That meant someone from inside the system moved the patient, intentionally, quietly, possibly with Simmons or Loretta's approval. That evening, Kiana wrote a short note by hand. No address, no recipient name, just one line. "If he's safe, please let me know. That's all I ask." She slipped the envelope under the hospital director's office door and walked away into the dark. She didn't expect much, but she needed to believe she wasn't crazy, that what she'd seen, what she'd done, what she'd risked, hadn't been erased into blankness by a system pretending it never happened. And several floors above, in a room with no nameplate and no label on the door, a man reviewed the footage, stored not on the hospital server, but on a personal hard drive installed long ago. The man, silver-haired, slightly hunched, wearing a rumpled shirt, was the patient, the CEO, the one who had gone unseen. And now he was watching closely to see who truly cared when the entire system chose to look away. The ceremony took place on Friday morning. The north corridor of Rourke Medical had been cleaned out and transformed into a makeshift stage, draped with a banner that read, "Rourke Medical Honors Excellence, Frontline Recognition Ceremony." Rows of chairs were neatly aligned, fresh flowers adorned the welcome table, and soft piano music played from the hospital's internal sound system. It was one of the rare occasions when staff from all departments were summoned, from head nurses and senior physicians to representatives of the parent medical board. Loretta was overseeing the event. She stood to the right of the stage, scanning the guest rows with the sharpness of a professor invigilating finals. Dr. Simmons sat in the front row, crisp white coat, gray tie, and a printed speech in hand. The list of honorees was already posted on the digital board in the lobby. 5 nurses, 3 doctors, 2 OR staff, and 1 logistics employee. But not Kiana. The logistics slot went to a 10-year veteran who managed supply transport. Kiana wasn't on the attendance list, but she was there, quietly standing at the far end of the hall, next to a medical waste cart draped in a white cloth. From where she stood, she could see the amber lights on stage, hear the speakers echo across the tiled walls, and watch Simmons step up to the podium. "Today," Simmons began, his voice calm and resonant, "we celebrate those who uphold not just our standards of care, but our vision of leadership, courage, and professionalism under pressure." She said nothing. Her eyes didn't leave the man now speaking of courage, as if he had been the one who'd saved the unknown patient that day. "Last week," he continued, "a critical case entered our emergency department under difficult conditions. No ID, no insurance, no medical history. But what matters is, through swift decision-making and clinical precision, we saved a life." Applause filled the hall. The hospital's camera slowly panned across faces, capturing admiration and pride. Kiana gripped the edge of her cart. She didn't feel angry, just a strange emptiness in her chest, as if someone had quietly pulled her spine out without warning. "Footage of this event," Simmons went on, "has been compiled to highlight the excellence of our team and will now be played." He gave a nod. A tech in the back of the room started the projector. The lights dimmed. A large screen flickered on, displaying footage from the ER hallway cameras. The video began in chaos. A patient collapsed on the floor, staff walking by without reacting, a receptionist pulling out a phone, calling a supervisor, a few nurses arguing near the duty station. And then, from the left side of the screen, a girl in a navy blue uniform entered, pushing a stretcher, stopping, kneeling. Kiana. She didn't realize she'd stopped breathing until she felt her heartbeat pulsing in her throat. There was no background music, just the sound of beeping vitals, hurried footsteps, and someone yelling in the distance. Kiana on screen didn't hesitate. She lifted the patient onto the stretcher, confronted a security guard, and pushed forward as doctors stood by, arguing. Simmons turned toward the tech. "Stop the video. Wrong file." But the technician, a new hire just 3 weeks in, fumbled with the controls. The footage kept playing. Now came the scene of Kiana wheeling the stretcher through the emergency unit, clashing with Loretta, entering the surgical wing. Every second played clearly. Every motion radiated integrity. The hall fell silent. Loretta whispered something to Simmons, but he didn't turn. For the first time, his face showed something no one had ever seen. Unease. The first clap came from the far left row, a resident physician, then 2 nurses, then the entire back row stood, people who had witnessed whispers of the story, now seeing it confirmed. No one asked who Kiana was, because now they knew. The projector froze on a final frame, the girl kneeling beside the patient, hand placed on his chest, whispering something inaudible, but deeply understood. Simmons took the mic again. "Apparently, there has been a technical mistake." A soft laugh echoed from the back of the hall. No one saw Kiana standing there. She had stepped back into the shadows, but the smile she left behind stayed etched on the glass like a ghost's fingerprint. Meanwhile, Loretta, pale-faced, whispered to the nearest staffer, "Who approved this footage?" "We received it from the executive office," they replied. "No one knows who sent it." Loretta turned away, because she understood something bigger had begun, and every effort to hide the truth was now unraveling, frame by frame. No one in the auditorium moved. The projector had shut off, but the final image remained seared into every mind. The girl bent over, her hand placed gently on a dying man's chest, surrounded by indifferent stares and hurried footsteps. Kiana's name wasn't on the honor roll. She hadn't been called to the stage, but with one act, no microphone, no certificate, no script, she had silenced an entire hall. Dr. Simmons set the microphone down as if it had suddenly turned radioactive. Loretta muttered something and waved a technician to the back, her stride brisk and sharp. The air in the room stretched taut like piano wire. Everyone present knew something had just slipped from the control of hospital leadership. They had just watched a video no one claimed to have approved, and no one dared to ask who had allowed it to be shown. Only one man stepped onto the stage. No microphone, no introduction, no name called. He wore a black knit cap, a plain gray coat, and held a worn leather bag. His steps were slow but deliberate. Simmons furrowed his brow, half rising to stop him, but the man had already reached center stage, turned to the crowd, and removed his cap, revealing silver hair and eyes carved deep with time. Someone whispered, "Is that?" A senior nurse in the corner nodded solemnly. "It's him. That's Rourke." The entire room slipped into a stunned hush. Some people stood, some gasped, others murmured with nervous awe. But the man didn't allow interruption. His voice rang out, low and unwavering. "I was the patient that day." No background music, no applause, just a dreadful silence, like the ceiling had collapsed. "I walked into this hospital," he said, "in critical condition, no documents, no insurance, no name. And I wasn't asking to be saved. I just wanted to know if anyone in the system I built could still look at me and see a human being." He turned his gaze towards Simmons, then Loretta, then the entire row of executives. One person did the right thing, and she wasn't a doctor, not a department head, not an administrator. She was a girl with a stretcher. He took another step, placed his hand gently on the podium, and looked out across the stunned crowd. "My name is Nathaniel Rourke. I am the founder of this system." The words detonated inside every listener like a slap to the face. "I didn't go undercover to test anyone. I did it because I needed confirmation of something I've suspected for 5 years, that we've turned this place into a conditional service model, not a center of care." Simmons lifted a hand to object, but Rourke continued. "Dr. Simmons, I gave you control of emergency medicine because you were the only intern in your cohort who once argued that every patient, regardless of circumstance, deserved to be evaluated the moment they walked through that door. Where were you that day?" No answer, just a quiet flush spreading across Simmons' face. "And Ms. Loretta," he turned, "6 years ago, you emailed me these words. A hospital is not just where we heal the body, but where we protect dignity. And yet you scolded the one person who lived that principle." Loretta opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Rourke pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. He unfolded it and held it up. "This is the disciplinary report filed against logistics staff member Kiana Moore for overstepping her role. I read every word of it, and there was only one thing wrong. There should have been an additional report, one for every person who stood there and watched a man collapse and did nothing." A voice stood out in the audience. It was the ICU head nurse, rising silently. Then another, then a whole row. Not from pressure, not from protocol, but from shared awakening. Someone clapped. Then the room erupted. Spontaneous, unchoreographed applause. Nathaniel Rourke didn't smile. He just nodded. Slow, steady, solemn. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will be announcing a system-wide reform initiative. And part of that reform will require one non-negotiable: acknowledgement and honor for those without authority, but with heart." He looked across the crowd. "Kiana Moore doesn't have a medical degree, but she understands better than anyone here what medicine means." And then he stepped down from the stage. No security escort, no loudspeaker, no theatrics. Because in the silence he left behind, every other word felt unnecessary. The third-floor meeting room was unusually quiet following the recognition ceremony. A private emergency meeting had been called immediately after Nathaniel Rourke stepped off the stage. All executive leaders were expected to attend. But at the scheduled time, Rourke summoned only one man through the door: Dr. Thomas Simmons. Simmons entered more slowly than usual. He had once been known for arriving fashionably late, swagger in his step, a quip ready to assert his irreplaceable presence within Rourke Medical's emergency wing. But today there was no swagger, no smirk, no one waiting to greet him. Just Rourke, seated behind a worn wooden desk, the same desk that had anchored the original founding office of the Rourke system, unchanged for 20 years. The room had no glass, no logo, only a crooked pencil sketch on the wall, an old drawing of a patient holding the hand of a caregiver. Simmons glanced at the sketch before lowering his eyes to meet Rourke's. "Close the door," Rourke said. The door shut softly, yet it sounded like the air supply had been cut off from the room. Simmons stepped forward, trying to maintain composure, resting one hand on the back of the chair across from Rourke. He didn't sit. Rourke stared at him, eyes sharp and unblinking. "Thomas," he said evenly, Sit. Simmons sat, but stayed upright, hands on his thighs, posture alert. Rourke opened a thin file. Inside was a scholarship application from 18 years ago. Thomas L. Simmons, son of an immigrant laborer, part-time student, nighttime medical assistant to pay tuition. Beside it, a handwritten note, one of the few Rourke ever penned himself, read, "Give this man a chance. He remembers what it feels like to be ignored." Rourke didn't hand Simmons the file. He just rested a hand on it and looked up. "Tell me, Thomas, when did that man die?" Simmons swallowed. "Sir, Rourke cut him off. His voice didn't rise, but sliced through the room like a scalpel across marble. "No excuses. I asked you one thing. When did he die?" Silence. "Because I watched you today," Rourke continued. "I watched you stand on that stage, take credit for a life you didn't try to save, speak about courage you didn't show. I saw you wear that white coat like armor, but I didn't see the boy who used to sleep on clinic floors just to afford textbooks." Simmons inhaled. "I was following protocol." Rourke chuckled coldly. "You're too smart for that line, Thomas." The silence that followed was thick. Outside the building, it was raining again. Another long Houston afternoon. But inside, the storm was already here, humming through Simmons's chest like a ticking bomb. "Do you remember telling me about the time your mother had to wait 6 hours in a hallway because no one believed she was in real pain?" Simmons nodded faintly. "I do." "And do you remember what you said? You said no one should ever feel like they don't matter." A slow breath escaped Simmons' lungs. "That's why I became a doctor." Rourke stood. He didn't pace. He didn't lean. He went straight to the point. "Then what happened? When did you decide that a chart was more important than a pulse? That a name on a screen was worth more than a hand reaching out for help?" Simmons had no answer, because any answer would only be self-defense. And in this room, defense had no value. Rourke moved around the desk and stood directly in front of him. "You forgot where you came from, Simmons. You forgot who you were. And worse, you forgot who you promised to become." Simmons's head dropped. For the first time, his shoulders slumped. The powerful man of policy, of polished presentations and precise procedures, reduced now to a boy exposed for lying to his own reflection. "I'm not firing you today," Rourke said. "Not because you don't deserve it, but because I want you to carry this weight longer. I want you to wake up, look in the mirror and ask yourself, have I become what I once vowed to fight?" He walked toward the door. "I'm launching a complete retraining program for our executive staff. And you, if you still have an ounce of courage, will lead the apology to Kiana Moore in front of the entire hospital." Simmons looked up, voice hoarse. "And if I say no?" Rourke met his eyes squarely. "Then you're not the doctor I once believed in. And I'll make sure your name is a case study in every medical ethics class from Harvard to Houston." The door opened. Rourke didn't look back. "Get out and think about who you really are." Simmons walked out without another word. No escort, no farewell. Only the sound of rain growing heavier, and the quiet ache of a man who once wanted to heal the world, but forgot how to rescue himself. She didn't come to the hospital that day to work. In the system, Kiana Moore was still officially listed as temporarily suspended pending formal review. Her access badge had been restricted, her shifts reassigned. No one had sent her an official notice. No email, no memo. But deep down, she knew. The door she had once walked through silently each day had probably closed behind her. She could have quit, could have disappeared quietly, exactly the way the system had hoped. But she came anyway, not to protest, but for a man who once placed his hand over her heart without words, only a glance filled with gratitude in the OR that day. The man the entire hospital had whispered about for the last 48 hours. Nathaniel Rourke, not just the founder, but the survivor, saved because she didn't wait for permission. Kiana arrived early. No one had asked her to. She wore her old coat, heels worn down, and sat in the courtyard behind the building, where benches once lined the break area for staff between shifts. She didn't want to go inside, didn't plan to walk into the all-staff meeting happening on the third floor. She just sat quietly, hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm tea, eyes fixed on the tall windows above, where the system buzzed over something that was about to happen. Then the back door opened. A facilities staffer stepped out, handed her a small envelope, and said simply, "They've asked you to come upstairs. Mr. Rourke is waiting." She stood up, not rushed, not afraid. The hallway on the third floor felt almost ceremonial in its silence. She walked past office doors, past hushed glances. For the first time, people looked at her. Not past her, not through her, but as if finally recognizing something they had refused to see. She had always been there. The auditorium had no flowers, no guest list, just a small platform, and one man standing before it. No microphone, no title badge. Nathaniel Rourke wore a white shirt, a soft gray sweater over it, and held a long wooden box in his hands. He invited her forward. No introduction needed. As Kiana stood across from him, he didn't shake her hand, didn't pat her shoulder. He simply opened the lid of the box. Inside lay a white coat. Embroidered on the chest in soft pale blue thread were the words, "Kiana Moore, Human Dignity Officer." She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She just stared at the name, as if she had never expected to see it there. A white coat, not to practice medicine, not to command authority, not to signify rank, but to remind the system that she was the first one who had acted like a human being. Rourke spoke gently. "Because you didn't need credentials to do what others wouldn't. You needed courage and dignity, and both are more rare than diplomas." The room stayed still. No interruptions, no applause. No one dared shatter the moment. He continued, "From this day forward, every Rourke facility will have a human dignity officer, and you will define what that means." Kiana took the coat. Her hands trembled, not from weight, but from what it represented. A recognition that couldn't be revoked, that needed no signature. Loretta stood silently in the back row, eyes fixed forward. Simmons was absent. Some bowed their heads. Others nodded softly. But all of them understood. Change didn't begin with policy. It began with a stretcher pushed against the rules. With a bare hand on a breathless chest. No name, no chart. Rourke stepped down, leaving the stage for her. Kiana didn't speak. She didn't need to. She didn't need to prove anything. She just put on the white coat, buttoned it to the chest, and stood tall. And in that silence, she delivered a message louder than any speech ever given in that hospital. For the first time in years, Kiana Moore entered the healthcare system not to mop floors, not to push stretchers, but to redefine what it means to be worthy of saving. And in that moment, the white coat without a degree became the greatest honor the hospital had ever bestowed. It took just 48 hours for the name Kiana Moore to become the most mentioned phrase across Rourke Medical's internal network nationwide. A system once dominated by surgical success stories, quarterly revenue reports, and equipment upgrade campaigns was now overtaken by a single keyword: dignity. And behind that word was not a doctor, not a legal team, but someone once ranked at the lowest level of the institutional hierarchy: an unlicensed logistics worker who pushed stretchers. The afternoon after the white coat ceremony, every regional hospital director in the Rourke system received a high-priority internal memo, flagged with a red emergency reform marker. The subject line, Pilot Implementation, the Kiana Protocol, Phase 1. The document wasn't long, but it hit like a punch. The very first line read, "Beginning the 1st of next month, each Rourke hospital will appoint at least one independent staff member to the role of Human Dignity Officer, empowered to monitor the care of patients without records, insurance, or advocates, and authorized to intervene if patient dignity is at risk." At the bottom were two simple lines: issued by Nathaniel Rourke, inspired by Kiana Moore. The backlash came quietly at first. Some senior physicians dismissed it as external oversight creeping into clinical space. One even mocked, "Letting stretcher pushers monitor patient care? That's malpractice in slow motion." A few Midwest hospitals outright refused implementation. But what they didn't anticipate was this: the first to embrace it weren't hospital staff. They were former patients who had once been left behind. A viral post from a man turned away after forgetting his insurance card reached over 4 million shares. He wrote, "Maybe if I had a Kiana, I wouldn't have been sent home with 2 broken ribs and no money." Hashtags began trending. Number Kiana effect, number no one left behind, number dignity before paperwork. The media took notice. CNN had launched a new segment called Profiles in Quiet Power, featuring Kiana's story during primetime. One report included slow-motion footage of her pushing a stretcher down the hallway. No spotlight, no music, just the echo of footsteps on sterile floors. That image resonated louder than any speech Nathaniel Rourke had given. Kiana never appeared in the media. She declined every interview. She continued working, now under her new title, in a makeshift office on the first floor. The small room had only a chair, a desk, and one dry erase board, with a single sentence scrawled in blue marker. Every patient is a person. Treat them like one. Her first assignment was to train pilot teams at 3 Southeast hospitals: Rourke Atlanta, Rourke Tallahassee, and Rourke Houston Central, the very place where her story began. She brought no slides, no curriculum, no training videos. She simply stood before each group, mostly logistics staff, nurses, interns, and recounted the 3 minutes she spent pushing a man no one wanted to touch into the OR. Then she asked, "If it had been you, would you have just stood there?" Most looked down, quiet. She didn't shame them. She only emphasized, protocol isn't always wrong, but silence always is. And so began the first generation of Kiana officers. They didn't prescribe, they didn't sign off on medical charts, but they were given one power: the right to pause and ask, is this person still being treated like a human being? She was invited to speak at Rourke's headquarters in New York, the first time in the company's history that someone without a medical degree was granted the floor at a strategic executive summit. She brought no PowerPoint. She told one story: about 2 hours between shifts, mopping near the ICU, overhearing a patient gasping for air while no one responded, and how she walked over, placed a hand on their shoulder, and whispered, "I'm here." Midway through her speech, the toughest board member discreetly removed his glasses to wipe his eyes. She ended her remarks with just one line: "I didn't save anyone. I just didn't leave them behind." The following month, the Kiana protocol expanded to all 120 Rourke facilities. Every hospital mounted a small brass plaque in their main corridor, dedicated to those who stop and see. Not everyone understood it. Not everyone agreed. But almost everyone began asking themselves, when was the last time I saw a person, not just a chart, in front of me? And that's when the Kiana protocol stopped being policy. It became a wake-up call. 6 months after the Kiana protocol was enacted, Rourke Medical held its first nationwide summit in Chicago. The theme: dignity in modern healthcare. The event was broadcast live across the country, not because of its medical agenda, but because of the second line on the program: closing speaker, Kiana Moore. Kiana had never addressed a national audience. She had turned down dozens of TV interviews, hadn't written a book, and declined every publishing offer. She still worked daily at Rourke Houston Central, in an office smaller than the night shift nurse's break room. But that day she stood in Chicago, not to talk about herself, but because the country needed an ending to the story it had quietly followed. Breath held. The auditorium was full. Front rows were filled with renowned physicians, hospital directors, and policy leaders. Behind them sat med students, volunteers, admin staff, and former patients. A screen above read, "Healthcare that sees people." When Kiana stepped out, no one stood. No music played. She wore a white shirt, black slacks, and the now iconic white coat. No hospital insignia, only her name embroidered in light blue: Kiana Moore, Human Dignity Officer. She walked to the center of the stage. No teleprompter, no notes, no cue cards. She began in a calm, steady voice. 6 months ago, I broke a rule, and I would do it again. No one laughed, no one whispered. She continued, I didn't go to medical school. I don't know how to read an EKG. I've never written a prescription, but I know what it looks like when someone's about to die alone. And I know what silence sounds like in a hallway full of people pretending not to see. A few in the audience bowed their heads. That day, she said, I didn't know who the man I pushed into surgery was. I only knew he had no paperwork, no insurance, and no one who saw him as a person. She paused. Everyone said I overstepped, that I wasn't qualified, that I crossed the line. Then she looked directly into the crowd. But maybe the line needed to be crossed. The words swept through the room like a wind through a forest of people. But she wasn't finished. Kiana looked down. Her hand tightened into a fist at her side. And then she said the last sentence. Not loud, not poetic, but with a weight that quieted the nation. I didn't save his life. I just didn't let him die unseen. Not a sound followed. The camera panned across the audience. No applause, no cheers, just stillness. As if the words weren't just about that patient, but about every parent left waiting in silence. Every stranger we've ignored. Every moment we've looked away from another person's pain. When the clip replayed online, the hashtag number unseen no more trended across all platforms. Hospitals beyond Rourke began adopting their own versions of the Kiana Protocol. Within 3 weeks, over 180 medical facilities across the U.S. announced new response without documentation policies. Medical schools began including a lecture titled The Kiana Case, Seeing the Person Before the Chart. At Rourke Houston Central, a small statue was installed in the courtyard, not of Kiana's face, but of a uniformed worker pushing a stretcher, bending down to hold a patient's hand. No face, no name, just presence. Beneath it, etched into a brass plaque, I just didn't let him die unseen. And from that day forward, across hospitals, clinics, and quiet corridors of care, whenever someone paused, bent down, and helped a stranger with no name, they simply said, because I remember what Kiana said. Perhaps what made this story resonate with millions wasn't that Kiana was a hero, or that Nathaniel Rourke was a millionaire CEO disguised as a patient. It was because, somewhere, in the hospital you once visited, in the hallway you once waited in, or buried deep in your memory, you were once the one who was overlooked. Or maybe, you were the one who stayed silent. Kiana didn't do anything extraordinary. She just didn't turn away. She chose to see where others pretended not to. She chose to believe when the system told her she didn't have the right. She chose to act, not with a title, but with kindness. And that alone saved an entire culture. If you've ever seen someone go unheard, if you've ever felt like you weren't important enough, or if you've ever asked yourself, should I step in? Remember what she said. I didn't save anyone. I just didn't let them die unseen. Drop a comment below if you've ever witnessed silent injustice, or if you've ever dared to stand up like Kiana. If you believe the world needs more people like her, like this video, and if you don't want to miss stories that make you feel more human every day, subscribe to this channel now.